Which preacher have you never tried to sound like?
Probably a lot of them. I think, the two that come to mind right away for me, the two of my favorites are Charlie Dates. Charlie Dates is just an incredible preacher, comes out of a black church tradition, and there's a way that he sounds, especially when he's thundering away, that I just would never try to sound like. So that'd be one. The other would be Tim Keller. I've borrowed so many quotes of Tim Keller, copious amounts of his content, but to try to sound like him, I just could never pull off that sort of professorial thing. Maybe if I put on a tweed jacket, it would help. But yeah, some of the best folks, you try to learn from them, but to try to imitate them, not a great idea.
Hey, welcome back to the Preaching Through podcast. My name's Dave. This is Luke.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, what's going on, man?
Dude, this is fun. I love doing this.
It's a lot of fun. This conversation got me thinking about all of my years back in ministry when I was doing music. And we were in a small group together, and one of the questions in one of our small groups was, if you could sound like any musician, who would you want to sound like? And I was like, this is the worst question ever for me, because I spent years trying not to sound like anybody else.
When people told you did sound like someone, who do they most frequently say?
I don't know. I'm kind of embarrassed to say.
Come on, man.
Can you take
Carmen?
me? No, it wasn't Carmen. It was Scott Stapp from Creed.
Oh, wow.
But they were huge at the time, so it's like...
Why would you be embarrassed by that?
Well,
Creed's the best, man. And they're coming back.
Have you seen the halftime performance when they had the acrobat guy soaring through the Cowboys stadium with his shirt off?
I saw that the other day. Someone posted something about how this is the most American thing they'd ever seen.
Yeah.
It was Creed at Cowboy Stadium going for it. I feel like when I have a pretty good Creed voice myself. When I want to really, roll the windows down and turn the music up. Oh yeah, that's awesome.
Creed was the one that I always got. And that and Third Day, because it was kind of like that was the era, and it kind of combined in there.
Yeah, Creed was the kind of Christian band, and Third Day was the really Christian.
Do you remember at all of the Christian bookstores, we only had one for the longest time. It was the Jesus Chapel out here, and then Berean and Lifeway made their way out. But
if you like Nirvana, you might like whoever. Yeah, totally. this was, for you young bucks, this was us growing up in the late 1900s. So, hey, this is how it used to be.
We tried to find stuff that it was I think my parents would approve of this, and I think this sounds okay. And I stumbled across, there was a band named 7 Day Jesus. I love 7 Day Jesus. I sent you a link. Did you ever listen to that link? I'll send it to you again. You can check it out. 7 Day Jesus. And then the lead singer, somehow the band disbanded, and then he went off and started another band called Matthew. So Matthew's another one that I liked. Okay. Delirious, the King of Fools, with the green cover and the guy with the weird glasses. Okay. I listened to that one.
I think we're losing the audience.
Okay. Anyway, going back to it,
you were saying you didn't like when people would try to say who I
tried so hard to get away from that, and I feel like that's what this conversation is about. Is hey, as a preacher, we may naturally gravitate towards sounding like this person or that person, but the mission here, as in your preaching ministry, is what's your voice? And so, to get right out off the bat, how do you think of that idea of your voice? What do you mean by that?
Well, everybody seems to nod their head in agreement when you say that a preacher needs to find his voice. Mm-hmm. Everybody just go, yeah, that makes sense. But then a lot of people go, well, how? And that's really what I think we want to talk about in this conversation. When I was in college, my senior year, I did an independent study. I had a Christian professor who allowed me to do a deep dive into preaching. I read some books and interviewed some pastors in town. And I remember one of the pastors, his essential definition of preaching was something to the effect of God's word through a personality. And that always struck me as that's kind of an interesting idea, because a personality feels pretty specific. It's that God isn't just speaking generally, but he's speaking through all the intricacies of how he's made a particular pastor and his personality. And so, that began me thinking through, what does it look like to have your own voice? And not so that you can have your own voice, but that you are just consistent with who you are as a person. And that does seem important. It's always funny to me when you hear a particular preacher and you can right away tell where he grew up. in terms of his ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Certain people, they just, oh wow, they sound like that guy. They sound like that guy. All the people in this denomination all sound the same. And that feels kind of unfortunate to me, because even though all those people are great preachers, it feels like at some point, it does just kind of go, well, is that really how God made you? And I realize we're in this age of authenticity, in this age of you have to express yourself in the perfect snowflake, unique way. And that's not really, I think, what's important here. I think what we're really striving for is just as much integrity and integration and cohesion between how God's made you and how that comes out in your preaching. That's what we want for you, and that's what I want for me.
Have there been any things in your preaching ministry where you kind of picked up on it and you were like, that's actually not really true to me, or phrases that you would say? Maybe you introed every message like one of the preachers that you had listened to, and anything that you kind of picked apart and it was like, I think I want to tweak that because that doesn't sound like me. That doesn't feel like me.
I'm sure that's the case, Dave. It's hard for me to think exactly of a specific incident or a specific phrase or something like that. But as I think we're going to talk about, part of how you discover your voice is by, in a sense, trying on some of the voices that you hear and seeing like where's their resonance there. So, yeah, I mean that's part of how you learn and part of how you develop your voice as a preacher.
Another question that I have before we get into the list of just kind of the items that we want to hit is: do you have a sense that after this, one of the ads that we run for the Preaching Lab, we referenced Tim Keller saying, hey, your first 200 sermons, they're not going to be great. You just need reps at this point.
Yep.
Is there a number or is there a milestone where it feels like after like 25 messages or after like 50 messages or 75, you should get an idea, or you should start to feel like, these are things that are true to you, or maybe these aren't?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think I'd want to try to set that expectation.
Sure.
At some point, really as soon as possible. And the more you preach and the more you get to do it and the more you get feedback and the more, the quicker you figure it out. I also feel like there's things that I always want to keep growing in and trying and experimenting with, and, ways that I think my preaching voice can evolve, so I want to be open to that as well.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about preaching through your voice.
A few years ago, a new pastor joined our team. He'd been on staff at another church for a number of years, had a lot of experience preaching. And before he preached for the first time at our church, I said, hey, after your sermon, we'll sit down and just debrief it and talk it through. And we did that. And I was able to give him some coaching feedback that just to me felt totally normal. But afterward, he said something that blew my mind. He said, I got more feedback from you after that one sermon than I've gotten all these other years that I've been involved in preaching. Now that stunned me. I grew up in an environment where you got lots of feedback, you got lots of coaching, but I realized that's actually not a common experience for most pastors. Most of us, we only get a little bit of a, hey, pastor, that was pretty good, or we get a nasty email, neither one of which are very helpful. And so I've created an experience where you can have the same kind of experience that he had, getting some tangible feedback as well as some really practical instruction on how to build and craft and deliver great sermons that are consistent week after week. I want to encourage you, I want to help you, and I want to come alongside any way I can. You don't need an overhaul, but a few small tweaks might go a long way to helping you be the preacher God made you to be, helping you find your voice, and helping you to serve the people God's called you to lead. So that's what the Preaching Lab Live is all about. To find out more, go to faithfulandfruitful.com/lab.
In my 20s, there was a guy who I was really good friends with. We were both actively doing music, actively developing our craft, and his vocals continually changed about every 6 months. He was constantly changing from sounding like Creed to sounding like Jason Mraz to sounding like, whoever the thing was at the time. And I remember thinking, like, this doesn't sound like you at all. Like none of these sound like you. But I also realized looking back that he was trying to find a way to stand out. He was trying to find a way to own his own voice. And he was working through a process that eventually came out with something that felt like him. Now, I think there was this combination of, I'm trying to be an entertainer, and that's not what we're talking about. I want to be an entertainer, so I need to have a unique value. And so that was kind of his mode, but I think there's some value in that, in like, hey, over time, you're going to work things out. So right off the bat, we're talking about finding your true voice in the pulpit. Is there anything that you want to say about that and about that process before we get into the deep dive?
Well, what I want to say at the front end is why I think this matters is because people are going to experience you in the pulpit and out of the pulpit. I mean, especially your family is going to do that, but really everybody. And if there's just this sense that you become someone radically different in the pulpit, I think it's just confusing to people. And so, it's obviously if we're saying things about God and about our lives that are inconsistent with how we're living, then we're being hypocrites. And that's not really what I'm talking about. I mean, of course, that's a problem if that's a problem. But it's more to say, like, does it just feel kind of the same to be with you in the pulpit and out of the pulpit? And one way I think about it a lot is like, it's your normal voice, it's your normal personality, it's your normal things you're into, probably turned up a couple notches because you're on a stage and, the room's big and it's a different thing. Like I definitely talk way louder when I preach than I do in my, around the dinner table. But I don't think my kids would be like, man, he just transforms into some totally different person. And so that's what it is trying to go, how do you just stay consistent with who you are?
That is the crux of the conversation. Is my friend, the reason why it was important for him to find his voice is because he needed to stand out and show record labels, hey, I've got something different and unique here. Whereas what we're saying is this is important because you have to be true to who you are and a consistent, application of that across the board, and maybe turned up a couple notches, like you said.
Well, and it's freeing. I mean, it's just, it's so freeing to not feel like you're performing, to not feel like the image I have is, the point at which, David shows up because there's this great battle, the Philistines against Goliath, and no one will challenge him. And David's like, I'm in. And so the first thing they do is they give him Saul's armor, and he clunks around in Saul's armor for a while and goes, this just kind of doesn't fit. And I really hope part of what this conversation does is that it gives some preachers the ability to go, the way I've been doing this doesn't totally fit. And I'm going to feel free to take off that armor that is actually someone else's voice. It's someone else's personality. It's someone else's emphasis. And I'm going to put on mine and experience the freedom of that and the joy of that. And then I think God will just bless that as it's just true to who he's made you to be.
So what is that armor made up of? What is that? What's the equation?
Yeah, when I think of how do you find your voice? Your voice is some combination of your personality, your emphasis, and your style. And, so let me just talk through those, I guess. So your personality is, if you're a funny person, your preaching should have some traces of humor. If you're a really serious person, your preaching should feel pretty serious. If there's just stuff that you're into, that should leak out in your preaching, through comments and through just the way you are. So there's just all the different things that would kind of make up a personality. And then there's emphasis. And there, I think every preacher has a couple of things that just really lights them up. It's kind of like John Piper has said, he's written however many books he's written, but they're all the same book. It's all basically Christian hedonism. God is most glorified in us. We're most satisfied in him. You kind of, pull the string on John Piper and out comes something about the glory of God, right? Mm-hmm. That's just the emphasis that he has. And so all of us are going to have particular emphases, particular areas of passion and strength. And those things are going to especially come out more often. And you're going to be kind of known for that within your church. And I think that's part of your voice. And then there's the style. And there I don't necessarily mean just like your physical style, though that could be part of it, is how active you are, how much you move around, but just the way the sermons feel. So this is less the content and more just the delivery, the vocal, the way you move your body, the way you, I guess, somewhat content, the way you kind of arrange the material, the way it flows, all that is kind of part of your style. So I think you put those things together and that's what we're really talking about when we talk about someone's voice. The most obvious thing is actually the way they sound, right? Like this person sounds like Creed, or this person sounds like Jason Mraz, but your voice encompasses some of those other things as well.
The point about the way that it's arranged and the way that the material works together, you were preaching a sermon on Christianity and sex. And there was a point that sex is glorious.
Mhm.
The second point, remind me what the second point was.
Sex is high stakes.
High stakes. Then you went to the third point and you said, sex is more important than we think or than the world thinks.
Mhm.
And I nudged Sandra and I said, the next point is going to be sex is less important than the world thinks.
And you were right.
And I was 100% right. But that goes to the point that that's very much your style. Very much I'm going to tell you, I'm going to prop this up, but then I'm going to tell you how we kind of get this part wrong.
Yeah.
And that's very much your style. And that's very much the way that you approach many of the messages.
That's in the preaching ABCs is, most life change happens in the moment.
Yes.
But also over time. I do like to play it both ways and point out the places where we over and underemphasize things.
So one of the big dangers
that's part of my voice.
Yeah. And I like it. I resonate
thanks.
with that.
Yeah.
One of the dangers is, as you're going through this process, is imitation. That's just a danger in life in general. Leaders, especially if you're taking in a lot of different voices, imitation is something that it could be good, trying things on, but it can also be bad or a danger where it's like not really intentional and doing things just because you've heard it done.
Yeah, I think imitation is actually a crucial part of the process.
Oh,
but it's a terrible place to land.
Uh-huh.
So it's a little bit like, how does a kid learn to talk? They imitate.
Uh-huh.
They imitate the sounds, right? There's a reason that kids that grow up in Ireland have a different accent than kids that grow up in Alabama, because what they hear and what is around them, and therefore what they then imitate, is what they learn to do. And so I think you can't help but imitate, right? You, Dave, famously had your Revelation sermon that you were asked to preach, and at some point you're drawing on, well, what are all the sermons I've heard, and what do I think they sound like, and what do I think they feel like? And you couldn't help but imitate something or somebody or some constellation of voices that had impacted you over the years. And so that's just inevitable. And that's part of the process. What I want to encourage us to do is to be intentional about what we're imitating and to figure out where are the places where we're imitating are actually incongruent with our personality, emphasis, and style, and where are the places they are congruent that we can then borrow from, learn from, have be something that gives a little accent to our preaching over time. So imitation is crucial, but if you end up just imitating, then it's just an imitation. And, on one hand, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. On the other hand, I can go to Turkey and I can get some imitation Nikes, and they are imitation Nikes, and they hurt your feet. And they actually, if you look close, are a little crooked, and it's just not as good. So why would you be an imitation Kevin DeYoung when you could be an authentic you? And I just would say, work towards being an authentic you, even if along the way you imitate Kevin DeYoung and you imitate Andy Stanley and you imitate whoever it is that you are trying to learn from.
Who are some of the people in your life who helped you hone that version of yourself and maybe spoke into intentionally or unintentionally to help you identify, oh yeah, that is kind of unique to me?
Again, I'm not looking for unique to me. I'm looking for true to me.
True to me. Okay.
So
that's a good distinction.
Not to push back too hard, but that is an important distinction. And I think the most valuable voices in that probably have been my wife, Molly, and then my longtime colleague, Matthew Brazelton, who's led with me for 15 years. And in both of those cases, there would be times where I'd say, hey, I'm going to try something. And I then afterward would go, what'd you think? Did that feel like me, or did that feel kind of weird? Or a very clear example of that, Dave, is something, that I saw Chris Brown do. And if you ever listen to Chris Brown from North Coast Church, incredible preacher, incredible communicator, he starts almost every message he does with a very dramatic story. Oftentimes that's imagining some situation that the characters in the passage he's going to preach have faced. And it's very dramatic and it's very edge of your seat and it feels like you're watching a movie. And, I was an actor as a kid. I did a lot of theater, and I'm always super hooked by his introductions. And at some point I thought, I want to try that. Like I want to do one of those. And so I did that. And that's a thing where I felt like this is an okay thing to have in my repertoire. And so I probably start a sermon like that once or twice a year. but I don't feel like it wouldn't quite be true to me to start a sermon like that all the time. And so I would try that, and Matthew and Molly would go, yeah, hey, here's some of what I thought worked there. Here's what I don't love. It's funny, actually. Molly, Chris Brown drives her crazy. It's like too dramatic, So, but Matthew has told me over the years that he actually, one of the things he really appreciates about me is that I'm willing to try stuff. And so I wouldn't want to be so afraid of imitating something that I wasn't willing to try it. And so I think it's important to try it, to try new things, to try new approaches, and then see, did that fit? Did that land? Did that work? Did I find that easy? Did I find that hard? Did that feel like I was trying to be someone I wasn't? And like any new thing, you have to sometimes try it a couple times. So maybe one time isn't the only thing. But I think it's that process of iterating. It's how you learn to speak. It's how you learn to accent. It's how you figure out, here's the stuff that actually really resonates with me.
How much of it has been, yeah, I like that. How much of it has been soliciting feedback from other people before you try something new again? Or you try that same thing again and I liked it, but this person thought it was not a win.
Yeah. I think if you're trying something and it feels sort of big, like it feels like, yeah, this is going to be, like a preacher might go, you know what, and this, it's funny that the silly things that we get into, but these things all make a difference. Like, do I want to have a stool up there? And do I want to actually try sitting down while I preach? Right? Because sometimes people do that. And I've done that before. I don't do that most of the time. I almost never do it now. But there were some times, and there have been times where I've thought, you know what, there's going to be a moment in this sermon where I'm going to want to kind of pull up a chair and have a little family chat moment with the church. And so I want to actually sit down and do that in that moment. Well, the first time you try that, it's like, this feels weird to like, what am I Andy Stanley now? And I just have to sit and am I trying to be this, something I'm not? And so that's where I think you're helped if you tell people in advance, hey, here's what I'm going to do. Here's why I'm going to try it. I'd love to get your input on what you think about it. Does it work? Does it work for me? And to assimilate that feedback and discern, does it work? Does it not? Are there moments to do stuff? One of my favorite things is to just, and I think this is kind of true to my voice, is to do different stuff and try different things, right? I don't always open a sermon the same way. Sometimes it's pretty funny and silly. Sometimes it's really serious. Sometimes it's let's dive right in. And I just think being able to have lots of different ways that you approach stuff, as long as it's consistent with you and true to you, is part of your voice.
Something else I've noticed you do for the first time was pull out a preaching board, like a on stage interactive monitor.
Yeah, like a touchscreen.
Yep. Where you will take a Bible reference that we are going through, you'll put it up on the screen, and you will use different colors to underline, circle, highlight, put a square around, make notations right there in front of everyone, and it's projected up on the iMac as well. Why did you come up with, or how did you come up with the idea that I want to give this a try?
A few years ago, I bought an iPad just for my own personal devotions, and I was really intentional. I didn't put iMessage on it. I didn't put any email on it. It was entirely just for reading and for spending time with God. And so I bought a digital Bible, and I was just reminded how fun it is to be able to mark stuff up, to be able to use different colors, to be able to draw different connections in a passage. A lot of times you're looking for a key word, and this shows up here and here and here. And in certain passages, when you actually visibly see the connection between certain words or phrases or ideas or parallelism or stuff like that, it's really pretty electrifying as you study. And so I was just experiencing that again in my own time with God. And I thought, at some point I hit a passage, I don't remember what, that I thought, oh man, I'd love to be able to visibly show this. And so I figured out a way with our tech guy to be able to plug my iPad in. And so that's how I started it. And I did that a few times and just got really great feedback from it, because a lot of people are trying to figure out, how do I study my Bible? And when they see you studying it, they go, oh, that's how you do it. Oh, I see that connection. I see how he got there. Also, there's just a lot of people in the church who are very visual. And so anything that visually is a change is just connects with their learning style. So I got enough feedback on that, and eventually thought, well, I don't love how I have to look down away from the the audience as much. And I think it could maybe even be more physically engaging if I did it as a touchscreen. But even there, that's a good example where, okay, if we're going to do this touchscreen, it's going to cost a couple $1,000s to get the whole get up on it. And I had to go, am I committed enough to this as something that I'm going to do on a somewhat regular basis that this is worth this investment? Does this fit enough of my style, enough of my personality? And so that was, again, a place where I went to a number of people on our staff and said, hey, do you think this would be worth it? And across the board, they said, yeah, like when you do that, it's really effective. You seem like you're good at picking your spots and when to do that. And that's worth doing. So yeah, that would be another place where I've iterated that. And I mean, you know, Dave, because you're here, I'll go weeks without using it and have times where people go, hey, when are you going to pull out that thingy? You know, and, so it's not a shtick. It's not a gimmick. It's not a crutch. It's not, well, I have to do that every time, but it's in the can and it's like a tool available if I'm going to use it. And therefore, when I use it, it doesn't feel like I have to. It also doesn't feel like, man, why is he doing that?
I think it's important to note that for people who don't know you, don't interact with you, you're fairly approachable with being able to say, hey, I noticed this, or I think this. And through Faithful and Fruitful, we have the Preaching Lab curriculum. And one of the things I just think is interesting, you are talking about preaching on stage and showcasing and modeling for people, hey, here's one way that you could make connections, study the Bible, mark it up, highlight it. And that's one thing that I'm constantly emphasizing to you is like, hey, I would really love for you to model this right here, how to do that. You're like, well, you think people would find that helpful?
To show how other preachers, how I came up with something?
Right, to show other preachers how you come up with something. And you're like, other guys probably have their way of doing it. I was like, I mean, maybe they do, but I'm guessing that a lot of them would love to see kind of how this part of the process works out. And what we're doing is we're not saying we're saying don't imitate us, but here's one way of doing it.
Sure.
And throughout this particular podcast, you've even said, now this isn't the only way to do it, but it's a way that's worked well for us and it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I like that.
Well, I just feel like you learn by seeing how other people do stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes you go, that's exactly how I want to do it. I mean, I've, recently, since I'm about to go on a sabbatical and I'm thinking about how do I be intentional with different stuff, the algorithm on YouTube has somehow started serving me up people's morning routines, and they don't all have the same. But every time you watch it, you go, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And sometimes they're really different, right? This guy says you should work out in the morning and this guy says you shouldn't. And this person says you shouldn't eat until blah, blah, blah. And this person says, no, eat right away. And this person has coffee right out of the gate. And this person, on and on. And so it really is like most of this, there's not one way to do it. Like you do have to preach the Bible. You do have to, I think, make it practical and accurate and clear and engaging. And then after that, ideally, it just over time sounds like you.
Well, that's the next point is the next part of the conversation is how do you transition from borrowing versus imitating and ultimately become your own?
It really is that trial and error. It's getting good feedback. And I think it's okay to have different influences. It's always interesting. My family, we feel like one of the few shows we all watch together is American Idol. It's maybe one of the few shows left that's appropriate enough most of the time to be able to watch all together. And these new folks come on and some of them right away, you go, oh man, that sounds exactly like so-and-so. But that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to figure out who am I as an artist and who should I sound like? And I think the most interesting artists, they would tell you, hey, I'm not trying to imitate anybody, but here's some influences. And you can occasionally in their music hear, oh, there's a little, I hear some John Mayer in there. Oh, there's a little bit of, I hear some Kurt Cobain. Oh, that's really interesting. I hear some John Denver. And so to have those influences, that's what I think. So I think it's great to borrow. And I think it's great to incorporate different elements of your communication into your preaching, as long as you're just not feeling the pressure that you need to be somebody else. Now, if someone just goes, you know what, I grew up in an environment and it just so happens I sound like someone else and I'm totally comfortable with it and it fits me, then I go, great, that's fine. Like, that's totally cool. I just don't want anyone to feel like, man, I'm having a bit of an identity crisis every time I get up. A team has to know, I'm a sports fan, and teams that can't figure out, quote unquote, their identity, right? Are we a running team? Are we a passing team? Are we a defense team? Like, what's the thing that really makes us us? And again, the world has gone crazy thinking about, well, who am I exactly? And so I don't want to send us on that journey, but I would say, you want to just be comfortable in your own skin. And if you're comfortable in your own skin, then you're free to not be really thinking about yourself. And instead, you can really be thinking about what you're trying to say and the people you're trying to love as you say it. And once that happens, that's what I think that preacher back in the day that I interviewed, it's God's word speaking through your personality. And it's your personality just freed up and ready to be used by God to do what he wants to do. And man, when that happens, that's pretty cool.
There's this balance that I encounter in not just my life today and doing marketing and running my own business, but it's been something that was very present in the music piece. And it was the reason these things, you talking about American Idol got me thinking about this. The reason why they're trying to decide who these people sound like is because they know that works. They know that sound or the way that this, like, there's a category for that, and that's been proven to work. And so we don't want to necessarily completely reinvent the wheel and be like, yeah, this is unique, but this doesn't work. Like, that's awful. So there's this art of categorize, this works. Don't say, I'm not going to do it because it's not me. No, like, figure out if it's going to work for you, apply it. One of the things that is in marketing too with sales is like, well, I don't do sales because I don't want to be salesy. Well, don't be salesy. Like, don't do it in a way that sounds salesy. Do it in a way that feels good and authentic to you. And so it's not just in preaching, it's in everything. What was it that Seth said, Dottie, in ministry, interviewed Dottie and said, what have you learned by doing XYZ ministry? It was... Yeah,
this was a lady who led the senior adult ministry that was called XYZ, which is really a sad name for senior, but it meant extra years of zest. And yeah, one of our pastors interviewed this gal who led that forever. And she said, what I've learned in this is that really all ministry is junior high ministry. Everyone's insecure. Everyone's trying to find their way. Everyone needs friends. And that's what ministry is and what it does. And that's what we want in this conversation, is for you to be free. I was recently just rewatching the movie Yesterday. I don't know if you've seen that, Dave, but it's a great movie about this guy who's in a bus accident, and he's a failing musician. And when he wakes up from this accident, he realizes that the entire world has forgotten the Beatles ever existed. They've never heard of the Beatles. They've never heard that. And so he really consciously makes this decision that he's going to start playing Beatles songs as though he wrote them. And what you see through it is he is just constantly afraid that he's about to be found out. He knows it's not authentic to him. He knows it's not real. And he's constantly distracted by knowing that this is kind of a fraud. And in the same way that if you're always plagiarizing someone else's content, you're going to feel that way. Well, I think it's also true if you're trying to plagiarize their personality, if you're trying to plagiarize their theological emphasis, if you're trying to plagiarize their style, you're wearing someone else's armor. And I just want to encourage you, don't do that. God made you. God's assigned you to this particular task, this particular place, and he intends to use you to pastor your people and to reach your community.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Preaching Through podcast. Every conversation, we're just looking for ways to communicate Jesus effectively in the 21st century, because there is so much change. And if this has been helpful, please take a moment, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And we're also on YouTube now. I've got the videos up on YouTube, so y'all can go check that out. If
my kids will think I'm famous.
Yeah, YouTube famous, which is a whole
Mash
category.
That subscribe button. The other day, my 7-year-old, who I don't think has ever spent any time on YouTube, was like, recording a selfie video on my phone, and he goes, "Mash that subscribe button." I'm like, wait a minute, time out. What happened? So anyway, if you find Preaching Through out there on YouTube, mash that subscribe button in honor of Hank.
As hard as you can.
Mash it.
Thank you for listening. Go back, check out all the other episodes. There's good stuff there. And hopefully through it all, you'll be able to kind of bring it all together, try on, see what works, see what fits, and ultimately be comfortable in your own skin delivering your message. So yeah, that's it. Until next time.